Welcome to Diabreadic, a podcast where a T1D artist and T1D expert come together to bake some bread, and then we break bread with smart and interesting people as we talk through the human in health and technology. I'm Stephen Horrocks, PhD and expert in experiences with diabetes and devices.
And I'm Melissa Horrocks. I am a type 1 diabetic, artist, baker, a maker of all things.
And for this episode, we are talking pizza.
Yay!
And yes, pizza.
Pizza night!
Pizza night. Pizza and misdiagnosis.
Yes.
With Dr. Josh Iddings. It's a fantastic interview. There's a lot of really interesting threads, some that tie back to previous guests as well.
Yeah.
So we're really excited. Come and join us.
Okay, so talking about pizza night, I know a lot of people have pizza nights. Not like that's a new thing or a new invention, obviously.
Yeah.
But we started, I'm trying to remember when it started. You said about 2 years ago.
I feel like it was about 2 years ago because I think it was just a couple of months before things with the pandemic spun out of control.
Yeah.
And so I think it was early in the year of 2020, like January.
Who knows? Time is even more elusive than it has ever been, right? So, but we started this tradition of kind of, once our kids were kind of into movies more, we were like, oh, let's have a pizza movie night. How fun. And I don't know, you know how it is when you just eat crap pizza all the time, and I don't know.
Yeah,
it's just blah.
Yeah,
so
it is what it is. It serves a good purpose. In fact, you know, we just recently had Little Caesars, and I have fond memories of Little Caesars. It does what it does, and it fills that gap well, frankly, you know, for what it is. But if we were doing that every week,
gross.
It's not as good, right?
Well, yeah, along with Steve's kind of intro into bread making and obsession, I guess. We started doing pizza nights, and it's really fun because it's, I mean, obviously you know what's going into it, so there's not a bunch of added sugar, which, you know, eating pizza takeout from places, you just never know what's going to happen with your blood sugars, speaking of diabetes. So this has been a great way to like enjoy pizza in a more manageable way. Blood sugar wise, at least. So we did kind of mathematically figure it out at one point, like the carbs in, you know, pizzas that we would get versus pizza that we made at home. And the difference is insane.
It's astounding. It's absolutely astounding.
There's just a lot of sugar added into the dough and the sauce and stuff that you don't really like know is added in there.
And part of it too is, as we've talked about in previous episodes, in conversations about how, well, different things that affect blood sugar. It's not just carbs either. Yeah. And so fats and
proteins too
make a huge difference. And so some of the ways that fats and proteins are in, again, not only the toppings of pizzas from various places, but there are also all kinds of fats and proteins that are part of the makeup of the sauces and, like you said, in the doughs and things that it's a wild card.
Yeah.
It's an absolute wild card every time.
Yep.
And so this way, we basically are making a very straightforward bread dough or pizza dough that we can then decide how we're going to top. And so we have been using a very simple sauce that we then are kind of whipping up on the spot and throwing on toppings. And it's been fantastic.
Yeah, this week was really fun. We let our kids choose their toppings, and it's hilarious because our kids are way more adventurous than I am because I am notoriously a picky eater. And so, you know, I am pretty picky, less picky in my adulthood than in my childhood. But I mean, they're putting olives and tomatoes and all sorts of things on their pizza, and it's nuts. And then it's funny when we get pizza takeout, it's like cheese only. I just want cheese on there. Just cheese. It's like so hilarious. So, I mean, they're eating better at home, I guess, than takeout.
And so for this dough this week, we did something a little bit different than we usually do. And so I'll mention both very briefly. First off, for this week, I thought that we were out of bread flour. I used about 200 grams and the bag was gone.
He says thought because the state of our kitchen is, I mean, we have the tiniest pantry you could imagine. So, I mean, to try and fit anything in there. So anytime we go to the store, it's like, let's reevaluate how to fit everything in here. So we had a bag of bread flour just hidden down on the floor.
Down among other bags of all-purpose flour too, for what it's worth. But anyway. So in this bread dough, pizza dough, we ended up using about 2/3 all-purpose flour and 1/3 bread flour, which most of the time we usually just go bread flour. And there are reasons for that, but it has more protein that produces gluten, and so you get the stretch that you want in the pizza dough. But because of that, we used a little bit less water than usual, so they were a little stiffer, and it actually worked out a lot better for the kids.
Yeah.
Because sometimes with that higher water content, you've got to kind of top it quickly and shoot it into the oven before the dough starts to kind of stick to the peel.
I'm imagining Harper like slowly placing olives. Like, come on, kid, just put on the toppings. Just spread them out.
One by one, meticulously where it needs to go. Exactly. She needs 5 tomatoes because she's 5.
Oh my gosh.
And so there are a couple of key kind of parts to the production of pizza in relation to the bread dough that I think are key here. First off, because this is a pizza dough, we usually include a little bit of olive oil in the dough. And that's it. That's the only thing besides flour, water, salt, yeast, which are the basic 4 pieces of bread making, a little bit of olive oil. The other thing is that you kind of need to use a pretty hot oven.
Yep.
And something to put the pizza onto and cook it on. And we are lucky.
Baking steel.
Yeah, we're in a position where we have a baking steel. And this was a gift from family. And it has been one of the most used tools in our kitchen, frankly.
Thanks, Dad.
But it's a 1/4-inch slab of steel that we put in there.
That's awesome.
And preheat the oven to 550, so as high as it'll go. And we shoot this pizza in there with a peel, and it's cooked in 5 minutes, and it's perfect. And so pizza has been really, and it's interesting, has been an important part of our kind of family eating practices, family time in general, for the entirety of the pandemic. And so that's a really complicated conversation too that I think has made this a pretty valuable bread experience for us. Yeah. So we will put some links to a couple of pizza dough recipes that we have used in the past. Our blog is not currently up and running, should be soon, in which case we will then be able to upload, kind of put up some of our specific recipes.
And pizza dough is pretty basic and not that hard to make. I think some people are really intimidated by, I know I at one point made the pizza dough and Steve gave me the instructions. And I was so nervous. I was like, I'm going to ruin it. But I mean, we use our food processor, which is really bizarre to think about using a food processor to make pizza dough. But I mean, it works great. So
30 seconds.
You don't have to have a food processor,
seconds.
Obviously, but that's kind of a fun way, different way to think about making pizza dough.
Yeah. So blitz it for 30 seconds and that does the kneading, and then you put it in a bowl to rise. So it's super simple. Makes for a nice Friday night, kind of take the edge off of the week for us. So. All right. Our guest today is Dr. Josh Iddings. He is an assistant professor of writing and communication at Siena College and has worked inside and outside of writing centers for quite a while. He was coordinator of a writing center, has also directed undergraduate research, and has published widely on topics related to literacy generally, but also teaching language and writing in the inside and outside the classroom, as well as, and importantly, cultural studies of Appalachia. And some of that may come into some of our discussion today. But also, he has lived in diagnosis with diabetes for some time, and so much of our conversation will likely center around there today. But Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Exciting to do this.
Yes, and we're excited to have you because there are a lot of really interesting things that you have touched on in emails that I think we need to explore a bit. But I want to start with this first question that we usually like to ask guests, which is, what is your relationship with bread, and what is your relationship with diabetes?
Yeah, bread. Bread for me is, I think, when I think of bread, I think of just tricky. And maybe that's actually what I think about when I think about diabetes, now that I'm saying that out loud. Yeah. I love bread. I'm not, I don't bake bread, but it's one of those things that, several years ago, I kind of got fascinated with cast iron.
Oh, yeah. And, you're speaking my language, Josh.
Yeah,
oh,
yeah. And then last year, I guess maybe in the last 2 years, I kind of started to expand my knowledge of cast iron and that sort of stuff. And I think once you kind of go down that rabbit hole, like you can't get away from bread. You got to get a Dutch oven. You got to start. And then you go down the sourdough rabbit hole, and it's sort of never ending. So I haven't gone down that path yet. And I say yet because I know at some point I will.
Yes.
But I think bread is pretty fascinating. I have brewed beer before.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm familiar with that sort of those ingredients and how little tiny minute changes can result in different flavors and those sorts of things. So
yeah.
So
cultivating the culture in order to kind of give a different effect, right? That's great.
Yeah. And I guess in relationship to diabetes and treating your diabetes and those sorts of things, it's you can think that you've set yourself up to have the same sort of quote unquote ingredients for both of those things and see what happens with the results sometimes. So,
yes.
With diabetes, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So you can't always control for all those wild externalities, right?
That's right. Diabetes, on one side of my family, I have an uncle who was type 1.
Yeah.
So as a child, he was really great about being open and honest about what it was, and why he was. This would have been, my memories of this would have been in the 90s. So I was I was born in 80, so I was preteen, teen years. And I can remember him. When we would see him, he would check us with his his meter.
Oh, yeah. Prick your finger and do the whole thing.
Yeah. And he was always very worried that we would develop diabetes and those sorts of things. So I was familiar with that was a thing.
Yeah.
But I'll also say that he wasn't great at controlling his own diabetes and oftentimes didn't. And unfortunately, he passed way too young from complications. And so there was also a kind of fear. Real fear. So, when I was diagnosed, originally, and we'll get into this, is type 2, just that diagnosis was very daunting for me because I had seen what it had done to him. And so a lot of fear around it. And I think it is can be a kind of scary disease. But these days, I guess that diagnosis was in 2006. So these days, I use a pump and I use a CGM, a glucose monitor. And so it's a lot less scary in some ways. Yeah. And I can feel more, mostly in more control and feel like I have some agency and some choice in how things go.
Yeah.
Again, I suspect like bread, I kind of eat the same sorts of things every single morning.
Oh yeah.
And, I drink the same coffee and all of that. And I can be, driving one of my kids to school and I'm looking at the monitor and I'm like, okay, why am I shooting sky high? I did the same thing I did yesterday, or vice versa.
Yes.
Why am I? why am I tanking right now when I did the same thing I did yesterday? So, obviously we know there's lots of other factors than just what you ate and how much you bolused, but so it can still be frustrating, but I do feel like now that I have the right diagnosis and I have some tools that I feel like are effective, because I can see the results of those tools in the data, both from, those 5-minute readings I get from the CGM, but from the A1Cs and those sorts of things.
Right.
Then you feel more empowered.
That's that dynamic between the trickiness and even fear, like you're talking about, mixed with the kind of empowerment that you're talking about. That tension there is a lot of what I find so interesting about exploring these kinds of experiences, because it's like both of those things at the same time. And having both of these things that are on the surface contradictory happening at the same time really pulls you in all kinds of directions. It gets really, well, to reference you a second ago, it's really tricky.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you were initially diagnosed in 2006?
Yes.
Is that right? So how did that initial diagnosis, type 2, correct? How did that initial diagnosis come about?
Well, so I had, so I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the Appalachian area of Kentucky. My hometown was kind of right on the border of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. Just to kind of give you some geographical points. But I had I'm adopted by my father. So I grew up not knowing my biological father, and I only met him essentially in my adulthood. And now, we're pretty close, and we talk and those sorts of things. And at the time, he had been diagnosed with diabetes.
Okay.
And so he was. Otherwise, I didn't know a lot of that the health family history. So I only knew diabetes as being something that was on my mother's side because of the uncle I was talking about earlier. So then he was kind of in my ear about, maybe you should get checked out just to be sure. So I would have been, I guess, 25. Mm-hmm. And, for as far as I knew, it was just something to get the family out of my ear kind of thing. And so when I went to a doctor, my general practitioner, and she was really skeptical. In fact, she didn't want to test me at all. Strangely, I mean, she kind of made me feel like I was sort of like making it up kind of thing.
Interesting.
And so I was, but I although it wasn't really my personality at the time, I stayed pretty persistent in the visit. Yeah. And was like, well, I just want to be checked. I just want to, just kind of know, just to make sure, just check it off, the health list. And so, so she left. I remember her leaving the room and telling me the nurse would be in. So she had the nurse come in and prick my finger. And the nurse was like, well, how you feeling? And I was like, oh, I feel great. And she said, she could tell by my reaction that like, I wasn't, at least I didn't think I was diabetic. Yeah. I think she thought that I was like feeling bad and knew I was diabetic. And so therefore was like, hey doc, can you check me and see where I'm at? And I think it dawned on her really quickly that like by my reaction, like, wait a second, this guy doesn't know he's got a problem. So she's like, let me go get the doctor. And the doctor comes back in like almost immediately. And I could tell she was just like, she's floored, She's like, so you're diabetic. My reading was 405.
Yowza. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, that's pretty high.
That's pretty high. Yeah.
And in fact, I'm like, man, I'm lucky in a lot of ways because I've heard a lot of horror stories about people being diagnosed way, way, way higher than that.
Right.
And so she just immediately jumped on type 2, and I didn't know any better,
Sure.
And so, that was how I sort of got diagnosed. But, as I was thinking about my journey over those years, I think a lot of it was I kind of sort of took for granted that initial diagnosis, never really questioned it. No one really, until right before we moved from Virginia to New York, no one had ever, that I recall, suggested that I see a endocrinologist. And I was never really in control most of the time. There were only really a couple of times where I felt like my readings were regularly good.
Yeah.
When I very first was diagnosed, I changed my diet. And I don't even remember it, now what I did. But I think I went for about maybe 6 months and things were pretty good. And then that went away.
Yeah.
I was back to out of control, and was really mostly until actually right around the time that I was doing my dissertation at Purdue.
Okay. So
it would have been probably right around the time that we originally met. I had some friends who, through the process, that those long hours of sitting behind the screen. Yeah. And sometimes it's kind of a lonely process and those sorts of things. I was trying to be proactive about my health at the time. And so I was trying to, I was basically trying not to put on a lot of weight and try to maintain some level of health in my mind.
Yeah.
Or what I thought was,
which is legitimately difficult in grad school, frankly. Yeah. It's a really difficult thing because you're taught basically to prioritize the work over everything, even when those things are basic life needs.
No, right? Absolutely. And so that's when I was just kind of reading, and I started reading about like the low carb stuff, the keto stuff, that realm, primal stuff. And so I tried that for most of the time that I was writing the dissertation and finishing that up. And again, it was much easier to control for me. But again, I still didn't have the correct diagnosis.
Right.
But it was better. It was better. And I had a lot of support in grad school. As you know, you don't make a whole lot in grad school, and we had 3 kids and we lived on campus, and I had a very, very kind nurse who would let me know when she got samples of things in.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That I could use in terms of my medication and stuff. But pretty quickly, originally, when I was originally diagnosed, I was put on metformin.
Okay. Yep.
I was on it until I was on that until I got the correct diagnosis. And, gradually, I remember being put on a long acting insulin, still being told I was type 2. When I moved to, like I said earlier, when we moved to Virginia, I just remember going and establishing myself at a practitioner and telling them I'm type 2. And it wasn't until, we were there 6 years. It wasn't until right before we moved that the doctor kind of put the bug in my ear of, I've been seeing you for 6 years. We think you're type 2, but like nothing we've tried has worked. We've tried Januvia, we've tried metformin, we've tried insulin, we've tried it all, and by and large, I have been basically out of control. And so he kind of put that in my ear.
And so this would have been around what year? Right before you moved?
So I left Virginia in 2019, and I remember having one last sort of checkup, I think in that summer.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved to New York. And again, like I said, that last time I met with the doctor, that last appointment, he sort of put that bug. Well, maybe you, when you go and you transition to a new place and all that, maybe you should look into an endocrinologist. So that's started
13 years after the initial diagnosis, and no one had ever suggested going to see an endocrinologist.
Not that I recall.
Yeah. That's wild. That's wild.
So when I came to New York, I needed to establish myself in a practice, and so I went and saw a nurse practitioner, and she walked in the door and asked me, why I was here. And I said, well, I'm new to the area, but I'm type 2 diabetic. And, I just want to, I'm sure at the time I was like, well, I just want to make sure I can get my prescriptions and, do all that. And she said, well, what makes you think you're type 2 diabetic? And I said, I didn't have a good answer except for, well, that's what I was told in 2006,
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, that's what I was told. And she's like, yeah, I don't think that's true. And I'm like, what are you, like the diabetes whisperer or something, So she's like, well, we can figure this out. I'll send you to an endocrinologist and we'll do a couple tests and we'll know.
Yeah.
And, that was good. That was positive, but also like kind of frustrating. Like, what if I'm not type 2? What if I am type 1? And I've walked around all these years thinking that and being frustrated and being out of control, in terms of my blood sugars. And, you fear the kinds of damage that can be done in those type of years.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, not to jump ahead too far, but I mean, there has been some damage that I've had to work on with my eyes, especially. So I go to, so then she gives me this referral and I go to the endocrinologist, again, meet with a nurse practitioner. They do some blood work, yada, yada. She walks in the door. Why are you here today? I'm type 2 diabetic. She says, well, what makes you think that? So I got the same exact reaction from both of these NPs.
Wow.
And same thing. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was like, maybe the diabetic patients they're normally used to seeing that have type 2 and sort of their perceptions of different things, body type, whatever, whatever it might be. There was some sort of initial gut reaction that like, that don't sound right. And so, yeah, she tested me and did a couple of blood tests, and I'm going to forget what they were now, but they're pretty common. Mm-hmm. And yeah, she's like, your body does produce a very tiny amount of insulin, but that's very likely to not last forever. But so maybe, I guess in hindsight, that's sort of what kept me out of ketoacidosis and all those things when I, all those years ago, was that, my body was producing some insulin, but yeah. So from there, it's been night and day. The frustration, it's not that it's not ever frustrating. It's still frustrating from time to time. Like I said, you do one thing one day, same exact thing the next day, and you get completely different results. But the fears that I had, especially being on insulin and the fears of hypos and those sorts of things, especially at nighttime, having the pump and the CGM as tools, and I'll say that all of this new diagnosis was happening, and me getting the tools, the pump and the CGM, was right around the time things were getting shut down because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Right.
And so, I was teaching online at the time, and I was staying home. So I was very fortunate in a sense to have some time to really sit with those devices and really kind of treat them as we're trained to do in grad school as sort of little experiments. Interesting. And so I had, data every 5 minutes about what my body was doing with X, Y, or Z kind of food. And, I knew how much insulin I was giving myself for X, Y, or Z sort of food. And so I was able to be super tightly controlled during those moments, during those months when I was at home.
Yeah.
Things got much trickier once things opened up again. And I could, as you know, I coach youth sports, and so baseball. And so that got tricky again. I learned a lot about my body and how it processes insulin and sugar and all those sorts of things as I would do the most minuscule of, I hate to even call it physical activity, like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
putting the chalk lines down for, a game, or, raking the field before and after a game. And I could just watch my blood sugar just tank. And so I had to again experiment with changing settings and stuff on my pump to compensate for that. And so that's sort of the journey that I've been on. So a lot of just frustration and worry about the long-term effects of not being diagnosed correctly.
Yeah.
There initially.
Yeah, and that's a long time too. That's a considerable amount of time, especially if you are fairly consistently high blood sugar throughout that period of time. Like you said, there are a lot of serious concerns in the short term, but also serious concerns in the long term. So one of the things about this kind of story that I find so fascinating, for one thing, the like moment of rediagnosis has got to be a wild time, especially since you had been operating under a certain understanding of what your body was doing at that up until that point. And it was riddled with nothing but frustrations, like you're saying, in relation to the treatment.
Yeah.
So how did, in those first, certainly first few weeks, I guess, but then thinking in a little bit longer periods of time out from there, how did your treatments, like the actual acts, the medicines that you were using, how did that change right then at that moment of diagnosis? And then, how did that change over the span of what is now about 2 years? Because certainly you wouldn't be able to just get a pump in that moment, right? But probably fairly quickly, but not that fast, right?
Well, I'll say maybe the strangest part of that process and that new diagnosis was, I think most people, being told, look, you're type 1 diabetic, there would be all of those original feelings that I had when I was originally diagnosed as type 2, fear, being scared, the unknown, all of those things. I was relieved. I was like, finally, I understand why these treatments I've been doing for all these years haven't really got me controlled.
Yeah.
I think I was put on insulin. I was using metformin. So I guess in a sort of, kind of dark way, it kept me from dying, but I certainly wasn't feeling healthy. And so I was relieved. I felt like I finally knew what the answer was in terms of what my diagnosis was, especially after having two experts tell me, that they were skeptical.
Right.
So the first, in terms of treatment, the very first thing was, the realization that like insulin was going to be a part of my life forever. Mm-hmm. Because when you're at least listening to the sort of pop culture voices around type 2, it feels as though things are your fault a little more than maybe type 1. And maybe there's a sort of hope that like, oh, if I do X, Y, or Z things right, I can get off these medicines and I can not have diabetes anymore.
Right.
But so type 1, I guess, in some ways for people may be more fearful. But again, I was so sort of tired of not feeling well that it was, I guess, a relief probably in some way to know that like this wasn't something I had done to myself in terms of sort of pop culture around the diagnosis. But I knew right away the realization of like the role that insulin was going to have in my life. Mm-hmm. So originally, you're right. The pump, you go through the insurance process and all those sorts of things. And so I didn't have that right away. What I did have was I started on a long-acting insulin and insulin for bolusing. And it's funny because I remember, again, as a child, watching my uncle give himself insulin for a meal.
Right.
And I always wondered why, and I think I remember voicing this to to doctors, but maybe I didn't. I always remember kind of wondering, like, well, I understand that I'm on this one insulin because it stays in my system for a 24-hour period or whatever, but like, how come I'm not giving myself, like, when I feel really bad is after I eat something that's like carby.
Yeah.
So like, why am I not doing something for that?
Right.
And I might, I could check my sugar and I would come down eventually from eating whatever carby meal I had. But it wasn't like I thought it should be. But I guess I didn't know enough to know really how to like articulate that question. But as soon as I had the new diagnosis, I mean, that was solved, right? You take the long term, you take your basal, and then you bolus a certain amount for meals. And so that's where I sort of got into the sort of experimental mindset. I started reading a lot more about type 1 and, how I can, help myself with diet and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it started with, I think, pens, using pens, which I was already, like I said, I was already familiar with because I had been on a long acting basal. And so the adjustment at first was how to bolus for a meal. And so I did that for a few months and not actually immediately, but within, the next appointment, check A1C and, and even in that small time period, things are starting to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, it took a few months as I recall, but eventually I start the pump, and that was pretty daunting. Again, I was very lucky that I had more free time because things were shut down.
Right.
And so I could spend a lot of time with it and learning the technology, but it was very daunting. I remember I had to drive north of the Capital District here. So probably 35 to 40 minutes from where we live. And that might have been one of the scariest rides home. They had hooked me up. They showed me how to use this device. And now it's like, all right, go home and, do all this. And I'm like, yeah. I just like, am I gonna just like drop on the freeway, like driving home? It was just, it was daunting. It was scary again for a bit.
Yeah.
Until I learned the technology and the ins and outs of it and felt comfortable with it. But at first I was exhilarated to have it, but then also like, now this thing is attached to me, where before when I thought I was type 2 and those sorts of things, it was there's a kind of distance. Diabetes for me is so weird because you can't really look at someone unless you're my nurse practitioners apparently and tell that they have diabetes or not. It's not a disease that's visible, and so you can absolutely kind of ignore it.
Yeah.
And your body adjusts. And in the moment, you have high blood sugars and you're consistently high. You don't even know that you don't feel good. You may be sluggish. You may be, you may not actually feel good, but you don't really, I didn't really realize that I wasn't feeling good until I started having things under control. And I'm like, oh, so this is what feeling good's about. So for, by and large, you can ignore it, but you get that technology and it's on your belt. And it's it's in your, you're under your skin and, I go places and, like I said, I coach youth sports. Right. So those kids, the kids are like, what is that thing that keeps beeping? Or, they don't have a filter. They just ask questions, which is awesome. And so like, it's attached there, and so for me, I think it's been mostly good. I didn't grow up with it. And so like, I understand there are folks who have a totally different kind of identity around that technology. But for me, being an adult when I was diagnosed and being so frustrated with not being able to control things before, for me, it's kind of just a constant reminder of being mindful of what I eat and how I treat myself and those sorts of things. it makes very visible what is very easy to think of as this kind of invisible disease.
Yeah, and it's that constant reminder of it, and it doesn't go away, especially when it is out front and center, right? It's attached somewhere, usually on the front of your body there, and it's got to be, you got to pull it out to interact with it, and so one of the things that you keep kind of gesturing back toward is the way that you felt before the rediagnosis and the way that you felt after, and you've mentioned how it was kind of in hindsight that you realized how bad you actually felt throughout much of that time. And so what did you feel like after this rediagnosis of type 1 and you started on these insulin regimes? What did it actually feel like to kind of exist now with this new medication that totally changes your relationship with your body, right?
Well, you mean, it sort of like having a certain level of blood sugar and sort of how that kind of makes you feel. And then, you get in better control and feel different, that sort of way? Or are you talking more like the emotional connection of that?
Well, I guess a little of both, because, right, you mentioned that it was the contrast between how you felt physically, how your body felt prior to this rediagnosis and after. And so there's that physical like feeling that itself is different, but then you've also then talked about how much of a relief it is. So it is certainly, it's got to be this mental emotional connection with how your body's feeling too, right?
Yeah, I think the biggest change with, especially after getting the monitor and the pump, was the feeling of being able to be an active agent in what was going on with my body. Knowing that like I felt sluggish and tired and those sorts of things. And when I was way higher in range than I really wanted to be, and that sort of constant frustration, and then not really necessarily knowing until I was, had better control, that a lot of that, that being tired and sort of sluggish and those sorts of things was a direct result of the blood sugar. And I didn't really necessarily know that in the moment.
Right.
And so like, over the course of, at first, at least, those first few weeks, and doing the reading and those sorts of things and sort of monitoring diet and that sort of stuff, just felt like, again, relief, but felt much more like I had some control over what was happening. Now, of course, I know that now that I've been doing this for a couple of years with the pump and the CGM, that yes, there are times when you can still get frustrated and you can still feel like you're not in, you don't have control. But like now, I can go grab, a pizza and know that even if, it's some local shop and I can't necessarily predict exactly the carb count, that I'll be able to utilize what I've learned about using the pump to get myself back in control pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It might be a couple hours, but we're not talking months and years anymore.
Right.
Or even days, like I'm going to be able to enjoy the food and be able to get back to where I want to be in terms of my readings. And I'll say that my body has changed in terms of now how I respond to different things. So for example, and this is very common, as you know, but if you're constantly at a certain range and then you start to come down into what's better ranges, you can feel those hypo effects, even if you're not actually hypo.
Right.
So that happened for sure. But I will say, as I've gotten better control, I am basically hypo unaware.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really weird, and scary. But with the CGM, mostly working, that technology works for me and keeps me in the loop about what's happening. It's kind of funny. My wife, she gets the beeps and all those sorts of things. You probably hooked up with those too. You get those alarms at 3 a.m. or whatever. She can sleep through anything. And so like, thankfully, in those, rare but scary moments, I've been able to, to wake up to those alarms. I have an older son who's 15 who, he's hooked up to the monitors as well. And so he knows, he gets alerts on his phone too.
Oh, wow.
So he's very, very, good about sort of, checking in on me and making sure I'm treating if I need to treat and those sorts of things. So, it also, obviously changed a lot of the sort of family dynamic and those sorts of things. And, so I guess the biggest kind of, now that I was, sort of in control and feeling really good about things, the biggest scare was the eyes. My NP suggested I get my eyes examined, and there was some slight damage already from, I assume all those years of walking around with high blood sugars.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I've done those treatments, and things have steadied out, and it looks like I'm good to go so far. So long as I continue to stay in control. But I'd say, in terms of real fearfulness, that's probably the only thing since utilizing these tools that has been kind of scary and. So I think just sort of feeling like I have some sort of agency around the disease and can have some control and get things back where I want them to be pretty quickly. I mean, I think it's true, even if I do go low, I can much more easily control how quickly I come back. I don't have to have that sort of rage chug of juice or Coca-Cola or whatever happens to be.
Yes. The entire jug of chocolate milk.
And then you're dealing with the opposite roller coaster of that. I can be, because I have those 5-minute data points, because I know how to sort of hone in on the insulin and and not having insulin and those sorts of things. I can, even in those really scary moments of being low, I know, like, okay, just give it a few minutes and I'll have it back to where I want it to be.
And being able to see it tracked through the CGM is a big deal in that regard, right? Because even if you were pricking your finger every, 15, 20 minutes in those cases, which used to be the case. I mean, prior to CGMs, I can speak in terms of Melissa prior to when she got her CGM, and she would have some of those scary lows. We would be retesting and retesting what felt like very rapidly, but it's nowhere as rapid as what the CGM is showing. And the CGM uses these calculations to show trajectories too. So if it shows that you're going up quickly, then you kind of take a breath, right? It feels different.
Yep.
And so, no, that's really interesting. And I'm also really intrigued about the way that your family dynamic has changed in relation to this new treatment kind of system that you're connected to as well. Because you mentioned that your wife has the Dexcom. I'm assuming it's the Dexcom, right?
Yeah.
Dexcom app on her phone, but your son does too. And that's fascinating.
Yeah.
First of all, how did that kind of come about, that he also is connected to this thing? What was the conversation there? And
well, I think originally it was because my wife Sarah was sleeping through some of those alarms. So I would wake up, I would treat myself or whatever, and then like the next morning I would be like, man, that was a wild couple of a few minutes or whatever, and she'd be like, what are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
Like, you don't remember me trying to wake you up and tell you, so I'm lucky that my especially my oldest son is Dylan is pretty techie kid.
Yeah.
And so like he kind of invested pretty quick in the idea of being connected to it, and I'll even get texts during the day if I've eaten something or if he's gotten an alert at school, that sort of stuff. He'll send me a text. Hey, Dad, are you testing? So I think one of the things that at least I was diagnosed. I think it was like 4 days after he was born. Mm-hmm. So like he's always known, and all three of our kids have always known that I have diabetes. But again, for all those years, it was like, oh yeah, Dad has diabetes, and it was like not kind of real,
not present anyway. Yeah.
And so that changed. I remember when I was first diagnosed and first knew I was getting a pump, I got online and ordered. You can buy these little Velcro pumps for like baby dolls.
Oh yeah,
that looks like a little T-Slim pump. And so I bought one of those and had it and like had a baby doll shipped for our daughter. She was into baby dolls at the time. So like that was sort of a normal part of like how some people have to live. And so, they're much more, the kids are now much more conscious of, and well, really the whole family of, mm-hmm. The constant that this is like you said, sort of a present thing for me. At first there was a lot of hesitation, like, can I still wrestle with Dad? Can I still like run up and give him a hug, for fear of pulling out the pump or, hitting the monitor.
Yeah.
And so, we tried to sort of like with the baby doll thing and just sort of like help them to kind of like treat me, normally, I suppose, as what they were, typically what they were used to.
Right.
But being cautious and those sorts of things. I check them every month. I have them prick their finger and check their sugar. And so it's a presence in their lives in a way that it wasn't before.
That's
wasn't
really interesting.
Super real for them before. But I don't have any, and maybe this was again a product of being an older adult when I got the pump and those sorts of things, but I'm not self-conscious about it at all. And so like everyone in my students, at the university, my kids on the ball teams, my colleagues, that help run the Little League and those sorts of things. Everybody knows what the pump is. I answered the questions and, I tell my students in a lighthearted way what it is, why it beeps during class.
Right.
If I'm checking my watch, which, I get readings on, I'm not, it's not because
You're
I
checking
think
emails or
it's not that their answers are boring or,
Can we get out of here already? Ugh.
Yeah. So I think they know that it's a presence, and from time to time I'll run into a student who's like, hey, is that a pump? Or you can see if they wear their CGM, in a visible way that, last summer I taught a course around Appalachian culture here at Siena with my colleague, Todd Snyder. And there was a student in that class that had a pump and a monitor. And she was, sort of excited that,
hey, me, it's like that Spider-Man meme, right?
Yeah,
where they're both.
Exactly. So yeah, it definitely has a kind of presence. It's so visible, and I don't try to hide it in any way. And so it just is kind of a regular part of the conversation. And we have this conversation at the beginning of the semester, like we would, or we have this conversation at the beginning of the baseball season. And it just, Coach Josh has to check his sugar. It is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. And I very much kind of appreciate and am intrigued by the way that this dynamic between the kind of presence of diabetes and these devices is happening at the same time as you feeling a lot better, and the lack of presence of diabetes prior to this rediagnosis and feeling pretty crappy, right? And that whole kind of dynamic between these two moments, but I say moments, but that's not even an accurate depiction of what is a many, many year kind of experience. And so it's really fascinating. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show and joining us, talking through a lot of these experiences with misdiagnosis and what that experience has been like since the rediagnosis. It's been a really fruitful conversation, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Okay, so that conversation with Josh was really, for one thing, that was kind of a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of fun like material that we were talking through, but one thing that I think kind of came through a little bit, and he made a couple of gestures toward this. He and I have known each other for quite a while, even though we haven't actually seen each other in a long time. Mm-hmm. And so we met about 10 years ago, and so it was good to have a chance to kind of see him, even virtually, to talk through some of these things. And I was surprised when the conversation started, and he jumped right into this reference to his budding obsession with cast iron.
Steve gets a glow in his eye every time anyone mentions it.
Because, like, I don't think we've really talked about this on the show.
Oh, no. Here we go.
We're not going to go down that rabbit hole because that's not what this is about. Because this is about bread and diabetes / chronic illness, not cast iron. But I really went down the cast iron rabbit hole. And there was a period of time when I was consistently checking all of the flea markets in town and secondhand shops.
You found some good stuff, though.
Found some amazing pieces of cast iron, and we use them constantly, every day. I mean, that's basically what we use, except for eggs that we have a non-stick pan for. But pretty much everything else we use cast iron. So I was like, "Holy cow, this is awesome!" And I was kind of surprised.
Yeah,
but I was most intrigued, I think, by the way that he talks through his really complicated relationship with diagnosis.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, we kind of talk about this a lot. Because we're both so fascinated by diagnosis and diabetes in general, obviously with our connections to it. But it's always really interesting to hear people's response to their diagnosis, because everybody's story is so different. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think what's most fascinating about it is we're all going through generally the same thing. Like, you're being told you have this, you are diabetic, and obviously everybody's story is so different, and it's so fascinating that we can connect. Even though every story is so different, we can connect with some of the emotions and feelings, even though in what he was kind of saying in his relief of his, second diagnosis, I guess you could call it.
Yeah.
That relief of like finally figuring out that like all of this stuff that he was trying to do in order to take care of himself was just failing. And I'm sure that really has an effect on your, psychological well-being of like, I'm just failing. I feel crappy. Like, anyone who's diabetic knows what it feels like to be high, and that sick, horrible feeling of that being high, and then feeling that all the time in a way that is all the time, always.
Yeah.
Is terrifying, like that, because he was feeling like that so much that it, like, you forget that that's bad, that
so
you feel
normal,
bad.
though,
it's like you're feeling terrible is your normal. So you don't even understand how bad you feel until you've come out of it.
Right. And, he was right there in around this moment of kind of grad school and some really intense career related things going on in life. And as he mentions there, that initial diagnosis with type 2 also happened, he said he thinks about 4 days after his first child was born.
Which is so nuts.
Yes.
Because anybody who's had a child understands like the whirlwind that already is.
And so you're just layering whirlwinds all together, right? It's like is it in Twister when the multiple tornadoes become one giant tornado?
Twister.
Yes. Dated reference. I know.
Who doesn't love Twister? Come on.
I mean, the funny thing is, I'm thinking about my students right now. Offhand comment. Many of my students who are, between 18 and 22, 3, 4, maybe pushing 25. I don't know if any of them may have seen Twister. That's wild.
Man, that's a question you'll have to.
Maybe I will.
Tangent.
But it is interesting because he's not the first person that I've talked to, and this would have been in the context of some research interviews rather than with the show.
Sure.
Not the first person I've talked to who was experiencing this diagnosis at the nexus of kind of like significant family changes and career changes. And, the way that these things ramp up together is out of control. And so, on the topic of this kind of complicated web of multiple diagnoses and what that means for his kind of general well-being and experiences and things, part of how this whole interview even came to be is an interesting part of the story.
I love this part. Like, it's
because
great.
Yeah, I mean, 2.5 years ago, I was posting a lot about bread making, and soon thereafter is when Melissa and I started the Diabreadic Instagram account. But I had been, just baking constantly. At least once, sometimes twice, in some cases 3 times a week, baking bread of various forms and sharing things, posting things. And he messaged me basically saying, wow, I've seen all of this bread that you're making. It looks amazing. How are you like making and eating so much bread as a diabetic? This is wild. And I then, because I had been also talking about my research and work and things. And so I then was like, well, I'm actually not diabetic myself, but Melissa is. And so, but it's also part of my research, yada, yada. We had this kind of exchange, and I mentioned that Melissa was type 1, and he said, oh, I'm type 2. And so, yeah, this interplay is really interesting. Conversation ends. This was December 2019, right? And so layering that with the way that he was talking through this, this was clearly like right around the time when he was in Virginia and or then New York, when his doctor was saying, hey, maybe you ought to see an endocrinologist, that then started the pathway to this other diagnosis. Fast forward to November of this past year when we started the show. And we put up the first episodes, and they were starting to circulate a little bit among some of our already established like networks and things. People were listening and getting feedback. And I got a message from Josh, who I hadn't talked to in, 3 years. I guess it was almost 3 years there. And he was like, this is wild because I'm listening to the new show, and I came in here to message you about it because I'm loving what you guys are doing here. And I see that my last message with you was talking about how I was type 2.
I can't eat bread.
I can't really eat bread, or at least not a lot of it. Right before this re-diagnosis. And so between our 2 sets of messages there is when this whole major shift in his relationship with diabetes happened. And so I was like, we got to get you on the show then. This is so interesting. And then, life and everything happened for months.
Yeah. Yeah. So I keep coming back to this, but it's just so great to hear other people's stories. And I love when Josh was talking about kind of his I think it's complicated to talk about it when like it was such a relief, and like he talked about it being this freedom that he was finally able to give himself insulin for food that he ate, and it like made sense, and like being able to figure out what works for his body, and like finally having this sort of almost a epiphany moment of your health, I guess.
Yeah.
You know? And what's so aggravating is to think about going to doctors for so long that I guess just have blind spots or whatever it is that causes this misdiagnosis to happen, because it isn't that infrequent that it's happening, right? It's happening a lot to people being misdiagnosed. And obviously there's a lot of different factors with diabetes that can go into this, right? Your body can be kind of in the middle of things, and you catch someone on a bad day or a bad decade, I guess, because wow, like that is sort of, that really affects people's lives. And, a simple blood test or a simple like acknowledgement of someone asking, can I get a blood test? He talked about how this doctor is kind of like, well, why? Like, I don't, that's so frustrating to think about. Obviously, I'm not a doctor and I can't like pretend to understand what it's like to treat all these people every day in and out. And I'm sure people are constantly thinking they have things or asking for tests or things like that. But, that's really affected his life. He could have lost his vision completely or, died. People die from this kind of stuff. So it's just really fascinating story.
And it was 13 years before he was referred to an endocrinologist.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what's nuts to me. It's like, 13 years.
That's a long time. Yeah. And part of it that, because I'm trying to kind of think through that. And part of it is that diagnoses of type 2 are very widespread. And there are not enough endocrinologists to be able to schedule out to see people as regularly as they probably need to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, even my doctor, she schedules out 2 appointment cycles. So I'm like, I just went to her and I had already scheduled 2 appointments out every 3 months. Right. So, we're looking into like 9 months from now, and she's already starting to book out, which is crazy. Like, I guess we need more endocrinologists.
Well, sure. But, and part of the problem is that they probably can't because of budget constraints. You can't just hire more people.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And so that's what's tricky here, is that there are so many things constraining how and why this process played out the way that it did. Yeah,
so many variables.
And so the fact that he went to this doctor that he had seen for 6 years in Virginia and had tried everything. They had tried everything and it wasn't working. Nothing was actually making him feel okay. And at that point, this doctor then was advising him and saying, listen, none of this has worked. We've got to get you like to an endocrinologist. I think you should do that when you move, because he was about to move. And there's this little moment of a read of this situation that was kind of an entry point towards this new diagnosis. But the fact that these other 2 doctors, like first thing they did when they interacted with him were to like question, not even question, but to engage him and his body and what was happening.
Yeah.
Right? Because he didn't say exactly whether he had made it clear to them that he had been trying all of these things and weren't working, but they had something in their experience that had this moment of, well, something doesn't seem to be fitting right now, so let's explore a bit. And it led to this diagnosis that has changed absolutely everything for him in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I loved how he was talking about kind of his kids and the sort of them growing up knowing about it. I love that he bought a little insulin pump for the doll. Oh, so
yes.
cute. And it's great that those things are being manufactured and made because, it's making it more visible to his kids, because it is kind of a weird thing. Obviously, our kids have grown up with my insulin pump and kind of know about it, but like to what level they understand that it's like putting medicine into my body, it's like hard for them to compute, but they know. And there is that sort of like, don't touch it. Like, don't pull it, because you are scared. Like, please don't pull it out. It's constantly almost being pulled out by the kids, And so I hadn't really thought about it as like, as a little bit older kids, can we wrestle? Can we play? Can we do all these things?
Right.
That was a really interesting kind of moment of.
Yeah. And I think that gets to one of the things I was really intrigued by in the conversation too. And that was when he brought up the fact that his 15-year-old is connected to his dexcom.
I think it's so great. And also like we often talk about, parents kind of keeping track of their kids and being able to like see if they're going low. But I think it's so great that like his son is, taking part of his life and his, treatment. And, we kind of laughed because it's kind of reverse. I sleep through everything. He was talking about how his wife sleeps through everything, but I'm the one who sleeps through everything. And Steve's like waking me up being like, Are you low? Are you low? Your thing's beeping.
Hey,
what's
that saying? What's that saying? What's that saying?
Oh, and I get so like I'm a deep sleeper, and so it was funny to kind of hear the reverse side of this as having this like crazy low story in the middle of the night, and then having your partner be like, "What?
What?"
Which is probably how Steve feels about me. I'm like so low, I don't remember anyway. But
I don't know if that's ever happened, but.
I usually lows kind of wake me up.
You remember,
or I don't know. I'm like sweaty or something.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly wake you up most of the time, but then you're awake and you get it. But anyway, but that moment where he's talking about how his son is texting him from school to check in and see if he's testing and things. There, it points toward the way that his like diabetes, but also then these treatment devices and the regimens involved in his injections and all these kinds of things are part of the family.
Yep.
Right? It's not just about his own body itself, but they're like, they have a presence in the family.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, how having diabetes in your circle really becomes about everybody's experience within it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm really fascinated with that. We've talked about that a lot. We're going to be doing some interviews as a segment of part of this, of talking about how diabetes can kind of like be a story within the story of your family. Which is fascinating.
Yeah,
I love
for sure.
that he's involved his kids in this. And
and then also it bridges many other of these kind of social relationships too. And so he's talking about the way that he is engaging his students in the classroom. Right.
I love that too. It's so funny because I always think about it in reverse because I'm always the kid or the student who has to tell the teacher about it. But it would be great to like have your teacher tell you about this. I love that he shares that with his classes and stuff.
Yeah, because like on a practical level, it is true. If you're like pulling out your phone or checking on your watch, or this thing's just going off in the middle of class, students are going to be like, "What? Like, what's happening right now? Like, this is an unusual scenario." But and that also then plays out on the baseball field because he's then talking about these other spheres of his life, right? And that bridges a couple of other conversations there, I think, in throughout this brief interview. Is fairly brief with him, but there were a lot of things that he covered. And one of the things that he pointed toward that I think was really revelatory in some ways, because we talked about the way that he discussed the feeling of relief from diagnosis, but he also, in some ways, was talking about the way that it totally changed his relationship with his body. Because you'll remember he was talking about how when he was on the insulin pump, and before that, even with the pens and bolusing regularly, all of a sudden, his blood sugar levels were down within ranges that have been more or less discussed as like in range. But he hadn't really lived in range for years.
Yeah.
And so the smallest little things, he would totally change everything. And so, he goes out and he runs the chalk lines on the baseball field and dive bombs.
Yep.
Right. But he didn't feel it. Right. And so this conversation about hypo and aware, and I feel like we've opened this discussion a little bit with you, but you've had that kind of experience as well.
Yeah. That feeling where you're all of a sudden really low because you didn't feel it coming, or like you don't recognize the low until it's like really intense. For me, at least, everybody's a little bit different, but that is kind of, it's funny because we'll go outside. We were talking about this when we were listening to Josh's interview again before we recorded. Just talking about the weird things like, we'll go outside to work in the garden and we're out there for 5 minutes in the humid heat and I am like passing out.
Done.
Low.
Like done.
I'm like, I cannot function anymore.
Yes.
I think the humidity has a lot to do with that, but it's just interesting hearing, the relationship with your body and figuring out, after so long, being high for so long and then being at normal levels feels like you're low because you're so used to the way you feel high. And that even happens short term, like in everyday treatment. But
for sure,
it was really interesting to hear that.
And so there's this like complex interplay between the relief of like feeling good for the first time in years. And hearing him talk about that's like, it's a like shocking kind of experience because it's like he didn't even realize that he wasn't feeling well. He knew that he wasn't feeling great.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until he was feeling better that he was like, holy crap, I've been feeling crappy for over a decade. This is out of control, right?
Yeah.
This is wild. And the second thing that really stood out there was the way that he was talking about diabetes visibility.
Yeah.
Right? Because diabetes is a chronic illness that is not outwardly visible, right? There are ways that it has been stigmatized
Yes.
and produced to supposedly be able to be represented outwardly, but those are problematic, and we've talked through those with previous guests and things as well, but it was not visible to him and his family, really, for that entire span between his initial diagnosis and rediagnosis, and was like not good. Like it was kind of crappy in general.
Just the constant feeling of like failing and not being able, like the frustration, we've talked about the frustration of when you are, mostly in control and then not being able to keep the control, right? Like those highs that won't stop coming and like, there's just, it's constant. We, as a diabetic, it's constantly changing. Your body is constantly changing. Every year your body changes, right?
Constantly, all the time.
Depending on what stresses are in your life or what experiences are in your life, it's constantly changing. And, so it's really interesting to kind of talk about things after you've analyzed this time frame, but when you're in it, living it, he lived that for so many years of just turmoil, so I can understand how that diagnosis then would be such a relief to finally have, which is kind of counterintuitive to think like diabetes. I think he kind of mentioned that like it kind of seems weird that I was relieved at the diagnosis, because usually it's like this whole kind of, new thing that you're like,
Yeah. Totally.
It's like you
reframes
just
your whole
slammed into
life.
a brick wall. Like what? Like,
Yeah.
let's reframe everything about my existence and my life. So it's really fascinating to hear kind of this different viewpoint of it.
Yeah. And with these new devices, because he talks towards the end there, that the insulin pump and CGM have become central, like parts of himself, his life, his family. And so what that means is that his diabetes is also visible now.
Yeah.
These devices make it visible. It is present outwardly to the people around him, family and otherwise.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of adds some interesting dynamics.
Yeah, I loved how he said, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not like embarrassed of it. Like it's here, it's part of me, it's who I am.
Right.
I share it with people. And I think that's kind of the hope that a lot of people have, is that like we can do that more and feel more comfortable, like sharing and, talking about it and talking through experiences, right? And feelings, because not everybody feels that way.
Right.
And that's fine, Some people are more self-conscious. Some people don't want, there's so many different stories. And I think that's a lot of why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To talk about stories and people's experiences and what diabetes means to them and what diabetes as like an experience and a life is.
So that wraps up this episode. Another thank you to Dr. Josh Iddings for joining us and facilitating such an important conversation.
Thanks for being with us. Subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram. Message us. We'd love to hear your story. If you want to be on the podcast, of course, contact us.
Certainly. And if you have ideas for topics that you would like to hear, we probably also know some other folks that would be great to come and talk about some of those things. So let us know.